Hello and welcome to my review of X-Men Elsewhen by John Byrne. I pre-ordered this book about a month ago when I first heard about it. I was pretty excited to get it. However, when I got the book, I found there were some pretty big dents in the spine here because of errors in shipping. They didn't package it very well. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for this book. It's a good book, but it has some dents in it and some pretty significant flaws. I know what this book is. I knew what it was when I ordered it. It is really just a passion project by John Byrne. It wasn't meant to be published really when he created this, but it is published now. So I think we need to look at it critically. So I will get into what this book is about, and there will be spoilers ahead. So if you haven't read this already, I mean, it has been released for free on John Byrne's website, byrnerobotics.com. He's had it up there since 2019, 2018, I think he started this. Sometime around then. It's been out for free for quite a while, but I am going to talk about some of the story beats, some of the characters, a lot of the things that happens in this book. So if you don't want to be spoiled, if you haven't read it yet, just keep that in mind. The other thing I do want to talk about before I get into the book is kind of the required reading for this. If you're not an X-Men fan, you might be kind of lost if you pick this up right away. I do think that you have to read Omnibus Volume 1 and Omnibus Volume 2, Uncanny X-Men Volumes 1 and 2 omnibuses, or basically X-Men number 98 to around 143 when John Byrne stopped drawing the X-Men. So I think you have to read all of that stuff to really understand what he's doing in this book and where it picks up basically at the beginning. Let me get the dust jacket off and I'll show you some of the other flaws that came when it was shipped to me. You'll get a better idea what I'm talking about with the dents here. Let's get that off of there. You can see right up here on the top, I got some pretty significant dents and there were some dents on the bottom. But overall, I did enjoy this book. But I am a hardcore X-Men fan. I have been reading X-Men my entire life, basically. The first issue I ever bought was X-Men number 224, right before the beginning of the Fall of the Mutants. And buying Fall of the Mutants off of the rack at the drugstore where I lived in my hometown, I fell in love. And I've been reading it ever since. After I got those issues, I started buying back issues, and I had back issues going all the way back to John Byrne's run. And even during the time I was buying X-Men, I was buying classic X-Men. So I was getting all of John Byrne's run and the Dave Cockrum run that was before that, and Dave Cockrum's run afterwards. So I've read basically every X-Men comic up until about 6 months ago when I stopped buying the new stuff. I stopped buying the new Uncanny X-Men by Gail Simone and the X-Men by Jed MacKay. I'm not saying they're bad, but I started buying omnibuses about a year ago, and oversized format is pretty much the only thing I buy anymore. So, with that said, let's crack this open and take a look at it and let me tell you what I like and what I don't like. All right, so let's take a look inside this book. The cover is gorgeous. I know this was the very first image that he drew that kind of spurred this whole project on. Let's take the dust jacket off. We got some stuff there talking about what it is. And we got a picture of John Byrne right there. Nice signature of his on the back. It's got some of my oil for my hands on it, but I wasn't too precious with this because, like I said, it was already damaged when I got it. This cool thing right here, and we got the spine right there. It's volume one. Again, you kind of have to read the other things that John Byrne did in X-Men before reading this. But we have this gorgeous piece of Phoenix right here. Um, and he talks about what this is, where it came from with Byrne Robotics and how he just started drawing one day and fell in love with drawing and just kept going and going from there, which I think is really novel. I really admire him for that part of it. And then we have a little bit of a flashback. This is stuff that came about in X-Men number 100 and number 101, where Jean Grey saved the X-Men when they're coming back in space and then became Phoenix. So this book basically talks about, though, like what would happen if during the Dark Phoenix saga that Jean Grey lived. And it picks up almost immediately right after that. At the end of the Uncanny X-Men Omnibus Volume 2, it has the whole story. They have the interview there with John Byrne and Chris Claremont and Jim Shooter and Louise Simonson, talking about how they came up with the idea that Jean Grey had to die. Originally, like Chris Claremont and John Byrne had not wanted Jean Grey to die at the end. And both John Byrne and Chris Claremont kind of had differing opinions on what should happen to Jean if she didn't die. And here in this book, John Byrne goes with what he thought would have been best. That's where I kind of have a problem. I would have gone with Chris Claremont's idea, which was to have Jean Grey just become depowered and become a background character for a little while, just get her own apartment in the city and kind of just become, the love interest for Scott and Cyclops. But they, of course, this is John Byrne's book, so he can do it however he wants. And the thing to me that is a little bit controversial, which comes up here, is that he had Jean basically regress to the mind of a 5-year-old. And even in the back of the Uncanny X-Men Omnibus 2, he talks about how he wanted Jean to be regressed to like a 9 or 10-year-old, which I think would have made maybe a little more sense than 5 years old. I'm not sure why he went with 5 in this book. Because if you know anything again about the history of the X-Men, Jean Grey's powers began when she was 9 or 10 years old, when one of her best friends was hit by a car and killed, and she was in her mind, like witnessing her die and watching her life fade away from inside of her mind. And that's when her telepath powers came about. And so it maybe would have made a little more sense to go back to that, to like 9 or 10. But even so, I would have preferred it personally if it would have been the way that Claremont would have wanted it, whereas she would have been just depowered, a normal person in her mid 20s, just getting an apartment in New York, like with Misty Knight, I think it was, she had an apartment with. And then just building that up to X-Men 150, where Magneto was going to kidnap her and then basically give her the power of the Phoenix back. And she had to make the choice of whether to take that power of a god or not. And I love how Claremont talked about it with addiction, but we're not going to go into that too much. I'm just going to take this as what it is. One of the other things that I was a little curious about why he didn't do this was we can see here Angel, who was with them on the moon when Jean Grey sacrificed herself, or, in this timeline where they fought against the Shi'ar and the Imperials for the Shi'ar to determine the fate of Jean Grey. Why he didn't have Angel in this book, I don't really understand. I think it would have been better if Angel was in this book, but maybe he's just not a favorite character of his. Okay, because like Angel was there in the Days of Future Past storyline. He doesn't leave the X-Men until a few issues after Days of Future Past. But whatever. Let's go into something I do like, which is this storyline in the Savage Land. Um, I think it's really interesting to have Sprite or Kitty Pride basically like stow along um, and end up with them in the Savage Land, and the whole storyline that happens here with we have Carl Lycos or Sauron here, and that's who they run into right away in the Savage Land. And Kitty Pride, ends up going into this AIM headquarters that are down there, and she runs into MODOK down in underneath the Savage Land. We have the AIM guys here, like fighting against Colossus, and then Lycos. Of course, he's going to turn into Sauron. That's on the cover of the book. You know what's going to happen. But having him fight against Storm again, and then Storm is the one who gets hypnotized this time instead of Wolverine as it was in their previous meeting. But then we have MODOK and AIM. They're down here testing on people in the Savage Land. He's also building this giant reactor or whatever it is to give himself ultimate power. It's pretty cool. I think this is probably a great way to open this book, and it's a pretty exciting adventure that they go on here. And I think MODOK is a good villain to have them fight against. It's pretty cool. I do like this storyline. We have a little bit of the Kitty Pride Colossus weirdness happening here. Like, that's always been kind of a weird thing, in my opinion. But it's never Colossus hitting on Kitty Pride. It's always the 13-year-old hitting on the 19-year-old. So I guess it's a little different, but it's still always a little weird. But again, not to harp on it too much, but it is pretty cool. What they have here going on with MODOK capturing all these people. And then we get to probably my favorite part about this is right here, where Kitty Pride or Sprite, she just takes MODOK and then shoves him through a wall and traps him in the wall. Why he didn't die from this, I'm not really sure, but he's still screaming, whatever, saying he can't move because he's trapped in the wall. Okay. One of the other things, though, that I do notice that is a little different with this book is just the way that it's finished. We have somebody else doing the inks. We have, going back here, we have the inks done by John Byrne and Paul Willis, with Walter Simonson and Scott Williams doing the inks. But most of it is done by John Byrne or Paul Willis. I don't think it looks as crisp, and I think this is a good example right here. I don't think it looks as crisp as when Terry Austin was doing the inks. He did the inks for John Byrne's art all through his original X-Men run, and it makes things look really beautiful. Just to illustrate here, this is a splash page from X-Men 115, one of my favorite issues with John Byrne, and we have Terry Austin doing the inks. But this splash page is amazing, and I just think the art just looks a little bit cleaner, a little more refined. I think that has to do with Terry Austin's inks. It could be as you get older, maybe he didn't care as much or just didn't try as hard. Or I know as an artist myself, I can't really draw as well as I did when I was in my 20s. But I just think like the lines look so much cleaner when Terry Austin was doing the inks for it. So I do want to just say that the inking does matter. I think inkers are undervalued in the comic industry. Most people just call them tracers, but I do think that Terry Austin's inks are just gorgeous. He does a great job, especially with John Byrne's amazing art. But another thing I like is this storyline with Lilandra and the Shi'ar, and she has basically captured the Phoenix. So they basically performed a kind of exorcism on Jean Grey and took the Phoenix and have captured it, and they put it on this like floating asteroid in Shi'ar space. Then, of course, we have the Return of the Sentinels. That's really the big storyline, the overarching storyline that goes through this book. Volume one is them fighting with the Sentinels. Here we get to another thing, though, that I do think would have been really helpful is if they would do like some little blurbs down here saying when these stories are supposed to take place. Because we have Wolverine and Nightcrawler coming back from Canada, which was X-Men 139 and 140. This takes place before Days of Future Past, where they go up there and they help Alpha Flight fight Wendigo, and they're coming back here. So I do think it would have been helpful in this book if he would have talked a little bit about like, okay, maybe even like a little blurb, like I said down here, saying this takes place after one X-Men 140, but before 141, something like that. That would have been cool. I don't really agree with Wolverine and Nightcrawler tearing up the X Mansion here either. I don't think they really would do that. I think some of the characterizations in this book are a little bit off, in my opinion, but overall, it's still a pretty fun read to me. Um, and going back to the really exciting part, though, is these brand new Sentinels that have like this force field on them that they can't really, the X Men really can't get through this force field, and it makes these Sentinels a lot harder to fight. Then we go back to Jean Grey, and she is, making this little bird fly, and it shows that she actually has still some powers that are going on because here her mom is saying this toy isn't supposed to fly. So you have this little bit of, ooh, maybe she has her powers, but she doesn't know how to use them yet or anything like that. Again, I wouldn't have made her have the mind of a 5-year-old, but whatever. But going on this as well, again, I do want to talk about this characterization a little bit more, is that they keep saying that she has the mind of a 5-year-old, but they don't really show that in this book. They don't really show her so much, being this childlike mind. They're just kind of saying it over and over again. And that goes back to here again, where they just kind of say that she has this childlike mind. They don't really show it. They do it maybe a little bit at the end, but I really would have liked a little deeper characterization for this to say, okay, yeah, this is what we mean by having this childlike mind. But he doesn't really go in depth with that, which is to me one of the bigger flaws of this book is that the characters don't have a lot of depth in this book. He even brings new characters into this book, and they don't have a lot of depth. A lot of the stuff, even with the X-Men, kind of just goes on the already based characterization that's there, and we don't really see any character growth going on with these people. These people that I have grown to love over my entire lifetime of, the past 40 some years that I grew up with these comics. I don't really see much depth happening with these characters, and I don't see much growth, especially with one of my favorite characters, Sprite or Kitty Pryde. But though I'm going to go back to something else I do like, which is this scene right here with Kitty using her powers to sink the Sentinel into the ground and just kind of leave him there like halfway through the ground with his head just popping up. So Wolverine can come over and just go. Psh. I do love the way that Byrne tells the story, though. Like, he is a very good visual storyteller. Like, you get this good sense right here. And I think he is great at just telling action scenes and showing how the action happens. I think that is his biggest strength as an artist and even as a writer. Like, he does plot these out really well, and you know what's happening, but just by the visuals. I think he does a great job of that. And then we have the Sentinel just kind of left here in the ground. It's pretty cool. It's interesting. I love Kitty using her powers in a more offensive way, you know, really going after people and using the full extent of her powers. In the original X-Men timeline, she doesn't really start doing this until the Magic miniseries. I think that's the first time you really see her use her powers in this offensive way, where she just kind of brings people into the ground and just leaves them there. I'm not going to go into it because it is kind of disturbing when she does that. And even here, like, there's even a part here where Storm says, "Don't do that again." And like I said, she doesn't do it very often. Even in the contemporary comics, like, she rarely will use her powers this way. But I do think it's cool. And then we get the main villain of Volume 1 here, which is basically Sebastian Shaw. This goes to another positive, though, that I do like about this book, and that is picking up this storyline that basically Chris Claremont just abandoned. There's a part at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga, or I think it's, yeah, X-Men 134 or 135, when they leave the Hellfire Club and Shaw meets with Peter Gyrick, and they're talking about re about initializing the Sentinel program again. And Chris Claremont kind of just abandoned that plot thread. As far as I remember, Shaw never had anything to do with the reemergence of the Sentinels in the main continuity. Really, the Sentinels didn't come back again in there until I think it was Nimrod. When Nimrod shows up around like 184, 185, something like that. But then we go into this storyline about father and son. This is probably, I think, the weakest story in this book. Um, we have the X-Men fighting dark versions of themselves here. We have, a dark Wolverine and a dark Colossus and a dark Storm, like, fighting each other. And it's all because of this little boy who's a mutant, named Willie, and his family. They come to stay at the X Mansion. We have a flashback here of them arriving at the X Mansion and meeting the X-Men, because they're talking about having Willie join the school. And then we have Nightcrawler go off and go to meet with Amanda Sefton, who is his love interest at the time. I really wish, like, they would go back to this. Like, I really liked the romance between these two, and I'm glad that Byrne picks it up again here. But something happens to Nightcrawler that we'll see in a little bit. But then, Willie starts using his power. We start to discover what his power is, and it's connected to his father. Like, him and his father kind of share this power, and they don't really go into what his power is, which is one of the problems, again, that I have with not only this story, but parts of the book as well, is that Byrne doesn't really kind of explain what the powers of these new characters are. He just has this power. He goes into a coma and creates dark versions of the X-Men, and then, like, his father comes there and joins him with the power, and then Professor X, like, wakes him up, and the story's resolved. And these dark versions, like, break up and they can fight him. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I really wish he would have explained this better, like what this kid's power is. But then there, Charles Xavier is just like, yeah, you're not a good fit, and Charles, being Charles, kind of does some shady dealings again here by altering these people's memories and just saying, well, we weren't a good fit, and it didn't work out. Sorry, it didn't work out. Charles is a shady, shady, shady guy. And if you've read any of the newer X Men, especially the Krakoa era, you know how shady this guy can be. But we pick up here again with Jean. It jumps around a lot. And it is kind of cool that he's trying to weave these other storylines into it. But I think sometimes when he jumps around it, it's a little bit jarring. But I do like the story that is going on though with Lalandra and the Shi'ar, with Gladiator here. He's one of my favorite characters in the whole thing with the Shi'ar. I've always liked this guy. I think he's underutilized in the X-Men comics. But then we have Sentinels attacking again. They take Banshee and knock out Moira McTaggart. Then they go after Lorna and Alex and take them as well. And then we have this new mutant, this guy Pablo and his mother. Pablo has some kind of power. They never really explain it. He creates this big monster man, this rock monster man that's fighting the Sentinels. Um, but they don't really explain what his power is and how he uses his power. They say that he has like a form of autism, or it's not like autism. He's more just like in his own head. He just doesn't explain it very well. I do wish Byrne was better at these characterizations. And to me, this is where Claremont's strength would have helped as a writer. Um, I think Byrne is great with big ideas, talking about story beats and like again, like the visuals are great. He does such a great job like being a visual storyteller. Like this shot is super cool. Both these pages are awesome, but he doesn't do a good job explaining like what's going on, and it could use a little more words. I know Claremont has like this problem of using too many words sometimes, but I do think it could use some more words, like explaining who this kid is and what his power is, because then he can control this car and make the car attack. They don't really go into it too much. And again, we go back with Jean and Scott, and Jean is still attracted to Scott, even though she has the mind of a 5-year old. I'm not going to harp on that anymore. But we have Professor X like reaching into Pablo's mind, and then they figure out a new way to battle these Sentinels, even if they have this force field on them, is to just rip them apart. I think Colossus is always underused in the X-Men, and he's not just some big strong guy. The guy actually has a really good brain. He's kind of underutilized sometimes, but he does make this mistake of trying to put their house back and destroying the entire house. But one thing I do like though is Professor X is bringing in Pablo and his mother to become, the housekeeper basically at the X Mansion, which I think is kind of cool. And we see what happened to Nightcrawler and Lorna and Banshee and Alex. Then the X-Men go to Muir Isle to try and find out what happened to them. And they run into Magneto. Of course, we got to have Magneto. He's the biggest villain ever. But we see a little more of like what's going on with Pablo, what his power is supposed to be. He's some kind of telekinetic, but I don't know. It doesn't make it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I wish again he would explain this a little more. But I do like, seeing Kitty like trying to reach him and stuff like that. I think he does do a good job with Kitty in this book. Then again, like I said, we have Magneto showing up, and Magneto, the X Men start fighting him. They kind of blame Magneto for Banshee's disappearance and Alex and Lorna's disappearance. But of course, they're wrong. We have a little bit of the multiple man coming in. Storm finds Moira and what happens here, and then they fight Magneto. Wolverine goes in and slashes up Magneto quite a bit. Um, Again, this is such a cool panel, very awesome art. I think he does a great job as a visual storyteller. This part is even pretty cool. Multiple man making multiples of himself and trying to help out, but of course, he gets in the way. Magneto flies off. They kind of advance the story again here, talking a little bit more about Jean. And this also I don't like. A 5-year-old is not going to run away from home. I just don't see that happening. Again, I'm not a big fan of what he did with this. Magneto comes up and just being a jerk, destroys this entire space station and goes into Asteroid M. Basically is, almost bleeding to death. He's been bleeding for over an hour. Sentinels start attacking other mutants, and they go after Scarlet Witch in the Avengers mansion. Takes her off. Avengers fighting along. It is cool seeing the Avengers in this, and we also get the Fantastic Four showing up here. The Avengers come and they kidnap Franklin Richards. Sorry, I just brain farted for a second. Franklin Richards, we know, is a mutant who has extraordinary power. And then this, again, I don't like the way that he's portraying Jean and what's happening with her. Like she basically gets she gets a ride with this guy who takes her to this sketchy bar, and they're gonna do things to her, which I don't really like that. I don't really like that story at all. But we get the X-Men they're going to go up to Asteroid M and confront Magneto. Then we get to, again, what I think is the stronger part of this book, Lilandra with the Phoenix, what she's trying to control the Phoenix power. I think that's pretty interesting and cool. We see them on Asteroid M going to look for Magneto. And this is cool. I love this idea. Basically, to fight off Wolverine and to save himself, Magneto just lets Asteroid M fall apart. Because he is basically controlling it all the time to keep this thing together. So then he just lets the thing fall apart. I think that's cool. We have a new character here, Ashley Martin, that comes in. They never really say what her power is, and I really wish he would have gone into this a little deeper. I think he's trying to cram too many things into this and not dwelling and going a little slow where it needs to go slow. But again, like I said, I'm being critical of this. I know this was his passion project, but it is published here now, so I am going to be critical of the story. This is pretty cool, though. They're trying to figure out what the Sentinels are doing. And then we have the X-Men floating in space. They have this spacesuit from this armband that, that Reed Richards developed so they can actually breathe in space. But then they go back to crash down right outside of the X-Mansion. They find out that Jean is gone, but they don't really go after her. It does, I mean, they kind of do, but they don't. But again, Jean kind of discovering new powers or some kind of powers. I'm not sure. They go to check up on Jean, and then right then, Sentinels attack. Then we get the big action for the rest of the book. One of the interesting things, too, that's happening is the Sentinels are starting to kill humans. They even kill this cop here pretty gruesomely, too. We get some good action happening here. Master Mold with Sebastian Shaw controlling him. Big action. We get lots more action and brand new Sentinels. Then we find out what happened to all the mutants that were kidnapped. They're basically in these Sentinels. It didn't take much to figure that out. It wasn't really a big surprise, but we have the Avengers show up to help the X-Men fight these new Sentinels. I love that Beast is still on the Avengers. He does, make the teams what they were at the time of this book, which I think is a good thing. It's cool. I love going back to the past, seeing the Beast on the Avengers again. And Jean has this power now to phase like Kitty Pryde. This guy tries to whack her in the head with a baseball bat, and it goes right through her head, and then she goes right through the door. I don't know. I haven't read what comes after this, and I'm not going to read what comes after this until the next volumes come out. But so I don't know what's going on with this. Please don't tell me in the comments. I don't want to know. I will find out when the books come out. But some cool action set pieces here again. Like this whole thing is basically an action scene from the rest of the book. We have Ashley here, this girl again with Professor X and Kitty, and she rips apart the Sentinel, but we don't really say what her power is. Her power was unleashed full force, but what is her power? You need to explain these things a little better, John. But let's go into what I do love again, though. The art, the visual storytelling is awesome. Like, John Byrne is a master at this. He was a master 50 years ago, and he's still a master at this visual storytelling. I love his splash pages like these two here. They are awesome. The way, that he tells the story visually is really good. It's super cool. This whole fight scene is awesome. Then we have Master Mold fighting back against Sebastian Shaw, finds out that he is a mutant as well. And Master Mold just kills him there kind of gruesomely and reactivates all of the Trask Sentinels, and they come into the fight. And then all of the good guys realize who's in these suits. It's all of their friends like Nightcrawler and Alex and Lorna and the Scarlet Witch. But then we have Sentinels attacking in New York. So they got to rush over to New York and fight them off. And the Invisible Woman goes to rescue Franklin, finds Gurek there almost dead. And what happens with the Phoenix? Lilandra basically becomes the Phoenix. This page is really cool. Oh, that art is awesome. I really want to see what's going on with this. I love the art on this. I think it's really cool. Then we go into the last issue. We have this beautiful splash page. This is why you buy the book. This art is amazing. Having the Avengers, the X-Men, Fantastic Four fighting the Sentinels. This is such a cool splash page. Again, this is why you buy the book. Byrne is a master of this part. It is so cool. The art is amazing in this book. We have him fight him off, save Franklin. Spider-Man joins in the mix, saves some people. Someone crashes outside of the X-Mansion. And Reed finds a way to disable Sentinels. We take down the Sentinels. They all crash all over the world. And the good guys win. Hooray. And right before this Sentinel is going to take down Jean, it crashes as well. But we end on a big cliffhanger. What's going to happen with Jean? She gets shot right through the chest. Please don't tell me what happens. I'll find out when X-Men Elsewhen Volume 2 comes out. Here's some of the Omnis that I have currently. I'm missing Volume 4, mainly because it hasn't been reprinted in a while. And I'm missing the Claremont Jim Lee stuff because that hasn't been reprinted in a while. But I have almost all of Claremont's run in the Omnis. So there we have it, X-Men Elsewhen. Is this as good as anything he had done before? I don't know. It's definitely not as good as the Claremont run of X-Men. It's not as good as Claremont and Byrne working together. I think I've pointed out the flaws pretty extensively in this and the writing style. I also don't think that this is even as good as Byrne's Fantastic Four run. However, is this good? I'd say it's good, but it is quite flawed. Is it worth buying? I think so. I'm going to buy volume 2. I'm going to buy volume 3. I want to see where he's going with this. I love the art. I think the writing is flawed. But would I recommend this book? I would say if you're a lifetime X-Men fan, it's a must buy. If you're new to X-Men, I'd say maybe buy something else. I'd save your money, buy the omnibuses I just showed, buy the whole Claremont run in omnibus, or even just a couple of them. They're going to be better than this book. But this book is pretty good. Thanks for sticking with me and going through X-Men Elsewhen by John Byrne. I'll definitely go through Volume 2 when it comes out in the fall, and Volume 3 when it comes out sometime early next year, I think is when it's scheduled. They haven't set a release date for Volume 2 or Volume 3, but I will pre-order them. Hopefully they won't come all dinged up on the corners like this one did. But until next time, bye.